During the last few days and week, the Russians have continued trying to terrorize Ukrainian cities. Germany has announced an enormous military package for Ukraine. The US and the EU have started secondary sanctions against companies who export components to Russia for their war industry. There is a new aid package coming from the US. The UK has given Ukraine longer range capabilities to defend itself. There have been fireworks in Luhansk, and who can forge Russia's display of power with their wanting parade. And Operation Bakhmut, about to fall, turns into Operation Wagner, retreating as fast as they can. And in unexpected turn of events, Russia air defense shows down several Russian aircrafts. Oh, and it looks like Lukashenko has been drinking Uncle Vladimir's polonium tea. Let's start with what seems to be Russia's main mission in so-called special military operation: bombarding peaceful cities with their sadistic hate for Ukraine. On Monday, they decided to test the Iranian drones by launching 35 of them to the Kiev region. The good news is that our air defense swatted every single one of them down. Finally, it feels like the world is collectively backing us and equipping us to protect ourselves as we sleep at night. But unfortunately, there is still bad news. The falling debris hit residential buildings in Kiev, and cars were also damaged, but there were no fatalities. And Russian propaganda machine? Well, they insist on blaming Ukraine these attacks. It's like saying, hey, don't resist the rapist, it will be over faster that way. Funny, right? During the night of the Eurovision final, which Sweden won, the Russians attacked Ternopil, the city where the Ukrainian Eurovision finalists were from, just before the start of their performance. Now, President Zelensky was in Italy, where he met the Pope and met the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who has reiterated her support for Ukraine, and thank you, Italy, for this. A Ukrainian journalist said that there were some big developments coming from Italy and would be stepping up their support in a big way. However, we do not know about the details. Now, Zelensky, after his trip to Italy, went to Germany, but before his arrival, the German government announced a huge military package for Ukraine of about $3 billion. This will include military vehicles, RST air defense, ammunition, and many other weapon systems. Yes, that's right. The same Germany that just before the start of Russia's invasion was talking about some helmets. The way that Germany has stepped up its support for Ukraine in a military sense in the last 4 months has been absolutely sensational. You will remember they released the Leopards in February, and since then their support has just grown. Thank you, Germany. This support will go a long way in defeating Russian evil. Zelensky has met with German Chancellor Scholz and the Minister of Defense Boris Pistorius. Now, I won't lie, we in Ukraine like this German Minister of Defense a lot more than the previous one, as he seems to get things done and quickly to get Ukraine what it needs. Okay. Now on to the sanctions. It is reported that the USA and the EU have started to apply so-called secondary sanctions against Chinese companies that export components that are used in the manufacture of weapons to Russia. Let me remind you that because of the sanctions, Russia's ability to source key microchips and their electronics, which are used in the production of weapons of various types, reduced significantly. Now, Russian suppliers are forced to act through third countries and foreign companies to obtain the necessary components. Because the supply chain is significantly more complex now, the aggressor country spends more and more money each month to source these materials, and secondary sanctions will make them even more difficult to source. If you're interested in learning about the impact of sanctions on Russia, I made a video about that a couple of days ago and I have linked it above. Guys, if you haven't already, please remember to hit the like and subscribe button. Well, you know, for the algorithm. Now, do you know what this beauty is? This is MIM-23 Hawk anti-aircraft missile system, which will be in the new aid package from the USA to Ukraine. The aid package itself worth over $1 billion, include 155 caliber shells, air defense equipment, and a whole list of various services related to intelligence, personnel training, and support. Christmas came earlier. 250 kilometers. That's how far the Storm Shadow missiles fly, which the UK is sending to Ukraine. Considering the impact zone, I think that someone in the temporarily occupied territories on the east and Crimea will get very hot. This is perhaps the biggest news of the week, or possibly since Ukraine received the HIMARS system. This type of longer-range system is what Ukraine has been needing for a long time, as it means that Russia has nowhere to hide on the territories of Ukraine. Maybe it's time for you to revisit the video in which a truck exploded on the Crimean bridge. In completely unrelated news, there appear to have been strikes in Luhansk over a couple of days ago, a city temporarily occupied by Russia that has been far away from the fighting so far. The strikes were carried out on an oil depot and on what appears to be some kind of factory housing military units, but the building seems to have been hit hard and taken a lot of damage, and a military barracks. Although the Russians claim that the military barracks were not a military barracks and was a residential unit, this is false, as we know that this is where the Russians housed and trained several of their military units. Details are still a little unclear, but what's interesting is that both these targets are about 100 kilometers from the current front lines. What's even more interesting is that fragments of an ADM-160 decoy missile system were found in the center of Luhansk city. These are generally used as decoy to misdirect air defense. Luhansk is an important Russian logistics and military hub. A few hours after the strike of the so-called factories, the Russian media also reported that the deputy of the State Duma, the same guy who said that Ukrainian soldiers would be laying down the arms and running away, Viktor Volodyatsky, has been injured, and there are several videos showing this. Definitely nothing to do with the new Storm Shadow capabilities that Ukraine has received. Do you know what real greatness looks like? If not, take a look at these images. You have just witnessed a sad excuse for a military parade in Moscow, which is held in Russia in honor of the victory of the Soviet Union in World War II every year on May 9th. The problem is that these parades usually showcase a huge amount of Russian equipment, but this year most of it was missing. Of course, they did have one full, whole, powerful T-32 tanks. I wonder what happened. The Russian president, in his speech, again talked about enemies around and called for unity, for victory, and about the world is changing and something about everyone is hating Russia. However, who he wants to defeat and what he's trying to achieve is still unclear. Oh, and Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator and Putin's puppet, was looking pretty sick and had to leave very fast after the parade. Rumors had that he was poisoned, but I would not rely on this information, and definitely we need to wait and see more news on this. Now, look, I'm not going to get into much details here, but we cannot really have a news update without mentioning Bakhmut. You know, the city that Wagner and the Russian military has been about to capture since September 2022. That same city where only last week Prigozhin was complaining that they lost 160 men to take 103 meters. Yeah, that one. Well, Ukraine has conducted limited counterattacks in and around Bakhmut and has pushed Wagner and Russian forces about 3 kilometers in 3 days. Fighting in the town itself is intense. However, the armed forces of Ukraine has wedged the enemy's flank in 2 different areas, and they have managed to recapture a little over 17 square kilometers of land. And we know this is true, as a master strategist, our Putin KGB would say, don't believe it until the Kremlin denies it. And of course, the Kremlin has denied it. I don't know if you've seen the videos of the Russians advancing rearward style where they leave behind all their equipment, but there is many of these videos. And if I'm going to be honest, it's not great to be a Russian invader in Ukraine these days. Certainly not in and around Bakhmut anyway. There is a lot more progress than is told publicly, but we will wait for official confirmation. Who knows, maybe all the pilots decided to smoke while flying the planes and was in fact smoking accident. Okay, but before we go on, I want to thank those who already supporting channel. This allows me to continue improving the stories I bring from Ukraine. And if you enjoy these stories and would like to support this channel, you can do so through my Patreon and through my Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in description below. Now, just yesterday we started hearing reports that there was a Russian air defense malfunction which led to them shooting down a Su-34 and Su-35 and 3 Russian helicopters in the Bryansk region. 9 Russian pilots were killed. The Russians were planning to bomb Chernihiv region, reported by Kommersant, specifying that helicopters and fighters were part of the same air group. The fighters were to deliver a missile, a bomb strike, while the helicopters were to back them up and pick up crews if the Russian Su fighters were shot down. One plane shot down can be put down to any state, but not even Russia is so incompetent to shoot down 5 of its own aircraft in one day. There are many theories about how this happened, perhaps the use of Patriot missiles that have been brought closer to the front lines, or a group of Ukrainian soldiers crossing into Russia to shoot down this with Stinger manpads, or possibly Ukrainian fighter jets laying a trap for them and shooting them down from behind the front lines, because they were aware of what Russia was trying to do. I won't speculate about how it happened, but it is the worst single day loss the Russians have suffered in a very long time. Deeper and deeper, as Kirill Budanov said. Now, after Russia's military parade, Lukashenko left very quickly afterwards, and now we are hearing reports that he is unwell and currently in hospital. No one really knows what is happening, but of course the rumors are going crazy. Did he drink too much tea? Will he fall out of the window? Anyway, the hospital that he is has been completely blocked off. If this was a poisoning and the Russians were behind this, perhaps they are growing tired of Lukashenko not sending his army to invade Ukraine. Or perhaps they feel that with Lukashenko out of the way, they could capture and annex Belarus, so they can show their own country that they have had some victory from their war. Anyway, this is all speculations, and we will find out if Lukashenko falls out of a window pretty soon. I'm proud of my country for a million reasons, but last week there was a video that gave me one more. Ukrainian soldier and drone operators accepted the surrender of a Russian soldier. Through sign language, the Russian explained that if he retreated, his own soldiers would shoot him. There is a longer video where one actually tried. This is heartbreaking because it shows a completely broken man desperately begging to leave. He is surrounded by lifeless bodies, presumably of his own unit. Despite the Russians have done to us, they have tortured and murdered our POWs. They have bombed our children, parents, husbands, wives, and friends. The Ukrainian drone operators not only accepted his surrender, but dropped a piece of paper with instructions on how the Russian soldier could get to the safety, and then guided him to a Ukrainian position where he surrendered alive. It was so powerful and so moving. Do you think Wagner or Kadyrovцы would do the same thing? I don't think so. Our soldiers had a thousandth reason not to accept his surrender. No one would have known, but they did it anyway. If you haven't seen the video, I really recommend you to do so. Words cannot describe how proud of them I am for this. Despite the evil and horror they face every day against an enemy, do not in a million years would do the same thing. They did not lose their humanity or their discipline. This is what Ukraine fights for. Even in the darkness and most difficult hours, our soldiers have the strength, the discipline, the courage and humanity to do the right thing. Glory to the heroes. And Slava Ukraini!